We saw that innocuous-looking cylinder of hydrogen where you get the protons from, but then you said at one point CO2 as well. And on that plot with the Bragg peak, there was also carbon there as well. Can you tell us a bit about that? What's a carbon doing?
So the reasons why we talk about carbon rather than just protons. The heavier you get, the narrower that Bragg peak becomes. So carbon is 12 times heavier than protons. You have 6 protons and 6 neutrons in the nucleus of a carbon atom. What that mass means is that, first of all, those glancing collisions aren't quite so glancing. So the energy gets directed more in the direction that you want it to. The proton beam spreads slightly because it scatters as it goes through. But the most important part is that the Bragg peak becomes much narrower. You get an even tighter dose distribution with carbon than you do with protons. The downside is, as you can see from the pictures of the Heidelberg gantry, you have to work much harder to accelerate carbon than you do with protons. So in one sense, the reason for using carbon is just because you get this tighter dose distribution with carbon ions. But there's a real kicker, and it's something we're just starting to discover. There's something about using carbon ions that stimulates the immune system. So when you irradiate a tumor with any kind of radiotherapy, the immune system is kind of bumped into life a little bit. The problem with cancer, just the one, the body doesn't know that there's anything bad because it's part of your own cells. So you've got all of these millions of years of evolution that are dedicated to taking something foreign out of your body and getting rid of it. With cancer, it's part of your own cells, so the immune system never kicks into action. But there's something about irradiating a tumor that seems to wake up the immune system. If you use carbon ions, that effect is greatly enhanced. So you get this much more enhanced immune response. And we're really starting to discover, we're at the very early stages of it. So there's something about using these heavier ions that gives you this enhanced immune response. Now, maybe if we use helium, which is lighter, it's only 4 times heavier than a proton, we'll get the same effect, but we won't have to expend so much energy getting the beam into the patient. But that's really the reason for using carbon. We started off thinking, okay, tighter dose, get the dose much closer to where we want it to. But now it's this immune response that's really interesting.
There's a question over there.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for the talk. 2 questions. First one, do you think this will completely replace radiotherapy because of less peripheral damage to healthy tissue? Especially the heavier elements that you were talking about there. And the second question is, that little boy that did have to go abroad for the treatment, why were the NHS so reluctant to let him go if it was a treatment that would have helped him? Which your talk implies it would have been, if you know.
So in answer to your first question, no, I don't think it will ever replace conventional radiotherapy. It's in certain conditions, like Snowy's, where you get a real advantage. But it's not just a blanket cure. The problem is it's that much more expensive than conventional X-ray radiotherapy. In the US, proton therapy has predominantly been used for prostate cancer. I think 85% of treatment is for prostate. The reason is not because, wow, it's an amazing treatment for prostate, it's because you've got lots of wealthy old white men with good medical insurance. So when you're talking about the business of medicine and you're trying to get as many patients through, you pick the ones that are easy to treat and can pay for it. Now, all of the clinical evidence that we have at the moment shows that protons are no more effective for treating prostate than conventional X-rays. So unfortunately, some of those centers in the US are starting to go bust because their financial models aren't turning out in the way that they expected to. We do a really good job with X-rays. Because of this conformal dose, this 360-degree sweep, we actually do pretty well. The downside with protons is if you know what you're trying to hit and you know exactly where it is, you do better, and you do better every time. But if you don't know exactly where it is, imagine that you're treating a lung tumor and you're trying to shoot a beam in from the front. Now, lung tissue is full of air, at least you hope it is. Imagine you don't quite know what the density is. So your beam energy is slightly higher than you thought it was. Now your Bragg peak is going through your tumor and either into lung tissue or into heart, spine. So getting the dose localization is much more critical with protons, and then even more so with heavier ions, than it is with X-rays. Because you have this low-dose bath everywhere with X-rays, the dose localization, you can actually move a patient, I think, up to 1 centimeter in any direction, and it doesn't have the detrimental effect that it would do in protons. So the other part is the expense, is that you now need to pay that much more for treatment. When the case was made to the Department of Health about building these proton therapy centres, it had to be on financial grounds. You had to make the economics. Now, if you have young patients, if you have children, you have to think of the side effects of treatment. So if you get better dose localization, particularly with brain tumours, you're doing less damage to the surrounding tissue. So with brain tumours, you don't end up with motor problems, speech problems. Actually, I say you don't end up. Those issues are less with protons. You are still irradiating healthy tissue, but you're just not doing it to the same extent. If you work out how much treatment you have to give to somebody who has been treated with radiotherapy throughout their life, it actually makes more sense to pay more money at the start for protons for some of those patients, and then, because you don't then have to spend that money throughout their life caring for them because of the side effects of the radiation therapy. So you have to be quite clear about where the advantages lie, much more so with children than with adults. I think the younger you are, the more benefits you're likely to see. Asher King is an interesting case. Now, you're asking that question of a physicist and not a clinician, so I'm going to give you my understanding as a physicist. Treating medulloblastoma is not just about the radiation. There's a whole process that you have to go through. So, first of all, you have to resect the tumor. You have to remove the tumor. Then you have to make sure that that cancer has not metastasized. So you need to take samples, I think, from the cerebrospinal fluid. And it takes a while for you to work out what the next stage of treatment is. And once you know that, it has to start very quickly. So there's a limited time frame where you have to deliver the right treatment. Now, if you take a young child who's in a very fragile condition and you say it's going to take a certain amount of time to take them from one country to another and then prepare them again for treatment, then there is the risk that everything starts again, because after a certain period of time, that tumor can regrow. The other thing is that what they had at, I think it was Southampton where he was treated, is you've got really good radiochemotherapy. So you need to do the multimodal treatment that I was talking about earlier. You need radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and surgery all combined. The advantage of delivering chemotherapy is it greatly reduces the chance of the cancer recurring. I believe that because he went abroad to Prague, he had the proton therapy, so what you would say is better radiotherapy, but he didn't have the chemotherapy. Now, I think the argument from Southampton was because of his health and because the time window is so narrow, it's not recommended to send him abroad. That's my understanding.
Over here. Oh, sorry, at the front there.
Hi, I was just surprised that you've still got a sort of 360 gantry, and I wondered if you could just explain that to me, because it seems to me that if you can control, at what depth the protons are firing, then you should only need to move it up and down or left and right a little bit, that nozzle, to be able to cover the whole, 3D object. So why do you need to take the gantry all the way around?
It's not about delivering dose to the tumor, it's about not delivering it to the healthy tissue. So an important thing to understand with X-ray radiotherapy or proton therapy, the amount of dose you deliver to the tumor does not change. You deliver exactly the right amount to kill the tumor. It's the residual dose that you're delivering that you're concerned about. So now imagine that you've got a brain tumor and you've got the patient who's set up on the couch from one direction, you've got a fixed beam line. You have one choice about which direction to bring the beam in through. If you could do it from both sides, now you've halved the dose distribution that's going through healthy tissue. If you can do it from multiple directions, then you have a further improvement in the dose that you're delivering to something you really don't want to damage. It may well be that if you have a single direction and you're fixed once you've built the machine, that there are certain areas that you would have to go through to deliver the dose to the tumor. So a good example is the optic chiasm, which is where the optic nerves cross over. Now that you absolutely have to avoid because it's very radiosensitive. If you deliver too much dose, you go blind in both eyes. So you always try and avoid certain structures within the brain. By having a gantry, by having the 360-degree rotation, it allows you to deliver the optimal dose and minimize the dose to healthy tissue. There are centers where you have fixed beam lines. The clinical opinion after they've been treating with those, except for eye tumors where it's very easy to localize the head and bring the beam in from one direction, is you would always prefer to have a gantry. If you can deliver from multiple directions, it always gives you better treatment.
Everyone back there?
Hello. So usually when objects collide with other objects, they gradually lose energy and slow down. So how come there's this Bragg peak where the most energy is given off at the end, whereas usually energy is lost gradually?
It depends what you mean by gradually. So something that's traveling quickly. So let's imagine a proton. Imagine the proton is traveling through and past the clouds of electrons that surround each one of the atoms in your body. The faster that proton is going, the more quickly it's going to go through that electron cloud. So the less chance it has to collide with one of those electrons. So you get fewer collisions. Now, as it starts to slow down, it's spending more time passing through the electron cloud around each atom, which means the chances of it making one of those collisions goes up. Now, if the chance goes up, then the chance of it losing a little bit of energy also goes up. So the slower it goes, the more collisions you get in a more compact volume. And that means that as it slows down, the energy loss goes up, so it slows down, so the energy loss goes up, so it slows down until it's got no energy left. So it's something like the inverse square of the velocity. As the velocity goes down, the energy loss shoots right the way up. But it's really the number of collisions that it's making with the electrons in the atoms.
Thank you.
Question in the middle?
I just wondered why you don't, instead of building a big gantry and doing it all complicated, if it's just a 2-meter in circumference accelerator, why don't you just move the accelerator? Or even better, why don't you just move the patient? Patients are easy to move and locate, and just move them.
That's a very big assumption. And actually, I don't mean to sound quite as sarcastic as I did. That's the key. There is a design of proton therapy facility from a company called Mevion in the US, where they mount the accelerator, they mount the cyclotron to the gantry and rotate that around the patient. Now it's actually called a synchrocyclotron. It's even smaller. It's about 1 meter in diameter. It has to be small enough that you can actually support it around that structure. You have to think you've got this enormous weight. Half the weight of the gantry is actually the counterweight. So you've got all the magnets on one side, and you've got this big counterweight on the other side, because if you tilt the gantry by 90 degrees, it's going to fall over unless you've got something to balance the weight. If you put the accelerator on one side, you've got all that weight that's offset. So if you look at the Mevion designs, they've got these 2 enormous arms that rotate the accelerator around the patient. The other thing is the biggest radiation source in the entire facility is that accelerator. So you have to keep it shielded in about 4 meters of concrete in order that you don't get irradiated by the accelerator itself. So you really want the highest radiation source as far away from the patients as possible, except for the bit that you can control. So you do all your radiation in the concrete bunker surrounding the accelerator and then deliver the beam in a clean way. Now, the thing about moving the patient around the beam rather than the beam around the patient, the way that you do treatment planning is you take a CT scan, so an X-ray scan, and you take 5 millimeter slices in all directions. That then gives you something similar to the MRI scans that you saw of Snowy. So you can see where the tumour is. In order to know what to treat, the first thing you have to say is, where is the tumour? And that's done by hand. So an oncologist will look at each slice in the CT scan and mark out by hand where the tumour is. The next thing you have to do is to say, well, I can see some part of the tumour, but I know, because of my expertise, that there is likely to be a little bit of spread. So then you have to enlarge that area out. The next thing you do is say, these are organs at risk, do not treat these. The next thing you have to do is to work out, if the patient moves slightly, how much do I then have to enlarge that volume? So that's done every single one of those slices in all three directions. And from that, you then work out your treatment plan, where you're bringing the beams in. You then set the patient up in exactly the same position as you've done the imaging for. If you move the patient, your internal anatomy is kind of like gelatin. So imagine that I am rotating you by 90 degrees. Your entire body has just slopped over to one side. So what do? Do you guess and say, with this high precision Bragg peak, it's probably in the right place? Yeah, I don't think most patients would sign up to that. What you would actually have to do is you reposition the patient, you re-image, and then you go through the treatment plan. So between moving the patient from one position to another, that's about 10 days. So because we can't be bothered to get the technology smaller and more compact, and you hear it from physicists all the time of, move the patient around the beam, it's easier that way. No, it's the treatment planning that you have to do, that's the difficulty.
So just to follow on from that, if you were treating stomach cancer and you had lunch, or you didn't have lunch, would that actually change the internal, because your body changes all the time, so
Yep.
Does that stuff,
Yeah,
how do
and
sort of guess that?
you see it with conventional radiotherapy. So, for example, if you've got a cold, then the absorption of all the fluid in your head changes what the dose deposition is going to be. If, as you get treated, you actually tend to lose weight, or some people will gain weight. You have to take that into account as you're treating. So if it looks like a patient's anatomy has changed too much, then you have to re-image and replan when you're in the middle of treatment. Now, previously, you would just do the treatment plan at the start and then treat with x-rays. But now you're starting to do more replanning as you go through because of those anatomical changes. You hope for a start that the tumour is going to shrink. But then that has an impact, particularly for proton therapy, on what the dose deposition is going to be. Because if you've got a lung tumour and you thought the tumour is a certain size, it's now half the size, you're now shooting the beam right the way through because it's not stopping in the tumour and it's going into something you don't want to hit.
Can we get the mic just down to the front here?
Thank you for a brilliant exposition of the subject. What I would like to know from you is, how universal are these proton therapy centres are? I mean, we know about Manchester, and we know now about London, and we know Heidelberg. What about the rest of Europe?
There are about 60, I think, that are open around the world. And it's a pretty much even split, 1/3 a pot, between the US, Europe, and Japan. Those are the three main places. It's still very definitely much less common than conventional X-ray radiotherapy. I mean, the cost and the size is always the issue. Heidelberg is absolutely vast. I think Heidelberg costs something like 1.5 billion euros. And that's one gantry and one treatment room with that gantry, and then you have two other fixed beam lines. You compare that to a conventional X-ray treatment room, which I think is about 5 million for the entire treatment room. So you go, there's no point in building that. The cost is ridiculous. But for some cases, then it's actually going to be beneficial. So it's always that trade-off. It's not particularly old. It's not nearly as mature as X-ray radiotherapy. So we know less. What we know is physics. What we understand is this dose localization. But how we deliver the treatment, that we're still learning about. We know much more about how to do that with X-rays. under no circumstances would I say it's universal. I would say it's still a few isolated centres, but it's growing, it's starting to pick up around the world. The issue is always cost. The cost needs to come down in order for the treatment to become more widespread. But also, X-ray radiotherapy does not stand still. It's not like, okay, we've got X-rays and then we're fine. The number of advances that have been made in the past 10, 20 years, going from fixed beam stereotactic to this now conformal 360-degree dose, it's really, really good. So my opinion is that it won't ever supplant it, that you will then you'll have all these tools in your toolbox that will do the job. I think X-ray radiotherapy is also going to get cheaper. So universal, no, I wouldn't have thought so, but it's part of your armory, it's part of your toolkit.
Got a question up there, was it?
You sort of half answered my question already, but I was also wondering if you think that there are potentially other uses for this, not necessarily in destructive techniques, but if you could see this going into other forms of surgery, like, I don't know, to deal with other problems, or like if you can only see it being used in cancer treatment.
Right now, I would be surprised if you would use it for other conditions, because it's big and it's expensive and you have as many patients as you can fill the treatment rooms with. So it's quite targeted, it's quite specific. The thing is cancer is far more prevalent than pretty much anything else. So if you take it away from cancer treatment and give it to something else, you're taking it away from the thing that you have to treat most often. So that's why I would have thought it would be unlikely.
We have a question over here.
What is the long-term implications? Are there sequelae that can happen, or are they predisposed to other type of malignancies, having undergone this modality since it's relatively new?
You mean as opposed to other ways of treating
Correct.
cancer?
If you were just getting, X-ray, XRT, obviously they would be predisposed long-term for all the X-rays they're taking in, and given that this is a new modality, are there any longitudinal studies on that?
Well, because it's quite new, I mean, the difficulty is if you're doing a patient study, you have to do the long-term follow-up, and that gets quite difficult.
Do you have any ideas at this point in time, malignancies that they might be predisposed to?
That are specific to proton
Yes.
therapy? Not as far as I'm aware, because you're doing the same thing. You're damaging healthy cells that give you these secondary cancers. So the damage mechanism is similar. At least that's the evidence that we have at the moment. It's just more focused. It's tighter. So the studies are, the studies are always ongoing. Clinical trials are always ongoing. Proper clinical trials are quite new, I think, in proton therapy, because the number of centres has been so small. To do those widespread clinical trials has been really difficult. You simply haven't had the number of patients, and then you have to do long-term follow-up. My understanding is that essentially you're looking for the same things, but they're just less pronounced with protons because of the conformal dose distribution. You do see certain things in protons that you don't see so pronounced in X-rays, but in the short term. So you get more skin reddening with protons than you do with X-rays. That may well be because the photon peak is a few centimeters into the body, so the skin dose is slightly lower. But that's not a long-term thing. That's a short-term thing.
Thank you.
So we're just about out of time. We've got time for one last question. I'm going to abuse my power by asking it. But Simon, I think, is hanging around after we close, if anybody wants to talk a bit more. So where do you see cancer treatment heading? So we've got radiotherapy and proton beam therapy, but there's nanotechnology and sort of getting into very small miniaturization, sort of from internal therapy. And then also gene editing and that sort of aspect of it. Where do you see things moving?
All of the above, and that sounds like I'm cheating you by not giving you a straight answer. For me, the most exciting thing at the moment is immunotherapy. And it's something that I've thought for a while. And when I say I've thought of it for a while, I'm not alone. There are lots of much smarter people who are actually doing something about it rather than just sitting and thinking about it. Your immune system has 500 million years of thereabouts of evolution dedicated to fighting off things that are unhealthy, foreign invaders. And as I said earlier, the difficulty is the fact that there is no recognition from the immune system of cells in your own body. It's kind of the opposite to having a transplant, where if you have a transplant, your body tries to reject it because it says, this is foreign, even though, yeah, but I need a heart. Stimulating the immune system, stimulating this incredible engine that we already have within us to do that job for us, that to me is part of the key. But I don't think it's ever going to be isolated. I don't think it's a one-shot deal. When people say, is there a cure for cancer? Yeah, well, there's lots of treatments for it. The best cure for cancer is don't smoke, for example. You looking after your health, that is a far better way of preventing cancer. Don't leave it up to the medics. Look after yourself. Look after your own body. Don't take in the carcinogens. That's really the most important thing. And we're starting to understand how our bodies work. We're starting to understand the effects of the things that we put in, the effects of our lifestyle. So I haven't even talked about treatment at that point. That's all of the preemptive things. I remember having a conversation with a friend of a friend who was sitting in a pub chuffing away on a cigarette and saying, when's the point at which I don't have to care about how much I smoke that you're going to be able to fix me of cancer? Like, no. The whole point is that you're a contributor to society, that at the moment, all you're thinking about is, I want to keep taking my poison. That's part of it, is our understanding of how we live so that our body does not accrue the damage that then leads to cancer. But on the other side, on the treatment side, you have several forms of radiotherapy. You have gene therapy, you have immunotherapy, all of the understanding of the apoptosis mechanism. I mean, that's another fascinating thing, the fact that you are waiting for cancer cells to do the job for you. You're damaging them just enough so that apoptosis kicks in and the cancer cell self-destructs. If you irradiate a cancer cell with enough radiation to kill the cell, you kill the patient. So you're still just doing a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. Why are some cancers radioresistant? Well, part of the reason is that the apoptosis mechanism is blocked. There are enzymes. The organ becomes flooded with all of these enzymes that block the apoptosis signaling pathway. Now get in the way of those, and suddenly you resensitize the cancer to any of the forms of treatment. Now maybe you add in a little bit of X-rays to give you the dose that you want to the tumor. Now you add in a little bit of carbon, which gets the immune system's attention. Now you add in some of the immunotherapy that says that I give the immune system a boost. Now I add in some apoptosis stimulating chemicals, and I get my chemotherapy right. It's going to be multimodal. The most important treatment mode is you looking after yourself.
Okay, I think that's a wonderful point to stop at. Look after yourselves. Thank you.